Well, welcome back. This is the fifth of 7 videos looking at business-driven risk management. And what we're doing in this video is continuing our conversation about cultural bias. And if you'll look at that chart up in the upper right-hand portion of the screen, we started out by looking at initiation and risk analysis. And what we're doing on this particular slide is looking at risk mitigation, that final component of design, implement, and monitor. You can see those over in the larger chart in the center. And what you've got mapped against this is the types of cultural bias that come from our 4 different groups and how they're going to react based on previous articles to this article, of course, how they're going to react to those security controls put in place. Because again, the emphasis on all of this is we're trying to mitigate risk by adding additional security controls. Those impact on users. Those users have a bias to that. And as we're going through that design phase, you can see that. You have the first group, the hierarchists, that don't want their normal workday experience to be altered. And if you're going to alter it, you've got to really justify that. The egalitarianism, God, what a hard word to say. And I even went and tried to practice it and failed. That's okay. But they're expecting that there's going to be resistance to this until everybody can have their say, everybody is involved in the process. For the individualists, they think there's going to be reluctance to accept this, and you have to come up with positive means of getting people involved and engaged in doing this. And you've got to make sure that there's some short-term that folks are going to pursue a short-term personal advantage until you convince them of the long-term benefit to them. And then finally, the fatalists are you're just going to have to force everybody. Nobody's going to do this unless you're able to force them and try to convince them that there is benefit in committing to the organization. All right, so again, you can see the differences here. Maybe worthwhile to pause the video, look at this a little bit, get comfortable with, and again, try to picture in your mind. I always find that helpful, of a person that kind of exemplifies or serves as a someone that you can see in your mind that captures the nuances of a fatalist, individualist, hierarchist, and so on and so forth. All right, now let's bring it all back together. Now we're going back to those kind of 3 big buckets, and you're looking at these 4 different types and looking at, again, well, what things do we have to do and how are they going to perceive information? Where are experts going to be valued? That'd be the hierarchists. Where are we going to value participation? Where we're looking for cost-benefit analysis. And then where are people going to try to ignore you and just accept because they're doomed in what they're doing. So then you can, that's in that initiation phase. As you start to look at the risk analysis, again, you see differences here in terms of a view associated with equity, a view associated with social order, a view associated with personal freedom, and then a view associated with doing risk analysis, because again, you're doomed. You might as well analyze all those risks. And then finally, out in the mitigation, you can see different types of approaches associated with this. And what you have to do is the idea is that you're not picking one, but that your population of users is composed of all of these 4 different groups, and you need to build in, as you're rolling out a particular control, that you've got things that address each of those different components. All right, well, that finishes up the previous video. We're now going to move into a completely different article, and we're going to talk about things from a completely different perspective. So we've talked about, over the last video, this idea of taking into account cultural bias. Now we're moving into looking at it from a very different perspective, and you're coming up and calculating out numbers, and you're choosing a leader between Tom, Dick, and Harry, and you're coming up with some mechanism of evaluating them so they get a score, and then you just adapt that score based on that. So it's this idea that you can build a process hierarchy, and that a process hierarchy is analytical, and involves multiple criteria, and that leads to people making decisions based on those criteria and some rankings mechanism. In this case, we're choosing a new leader, but ultimately, and you can see the criteria and how the alternatives rank out. In this particular case, it looks like Dick's going to get the job. But in doing this, that you could do the exact same thing for security controls, and that you could use investments that are going into implementing a security control to make choices based on that. And so a part of this is associated with coming up with those criteria, building the tree, having weights associated with it, doing a multi-attribute decision matrix that looks at each one of these, and then to automate the whole process in a spreadsheet. And in one of the other classes I teach, we actually spend a lot of time on this, the Intro to Security class, on building a multi-attribute decision matrix and using this specific approach to evaluate different courses of action. So this is the idea. And this is showing you where two different components are being compared, and you're looking at a incremental performance cost ratio associated with this. All right, so let's tear this down a little bit. So as we look at panel A up there on the left-hand side, we've got this $1 million proposal that's coming forward, and there are actually 3 different proposals associated with it. And as we're looking at proposal 1A, 2A, and 3A, we're comparing them against different criteria: confidentiality, data integrity, authentication, non-repudiation, and accessibility as a component of availability. And then what you see in panel B is where those rankings up above have been translated into particular scores. Okay? And so you're receiving a score. The higher the number, the better the number. And as you can see, for confidentiality, they were all ranked the same, so they all got the same score. That is giving you the total score out there to the right, the 0.551, 0.73, and 0.589. Well, good enough. If you're just evaluating those 3, this is a pretty straightforward mechanism for calculating, hey, I think we'll go with proposal 3A. The question becomes, how do you compare that now against a different proposal using, in this case, the same criteria? So here, we've got 3 different mechanisms for doing a $1.3 million proposal, and you have different scores associated with that. So in this particular case, you can see that proposal 3B still has the highest score or performance out of that. And it becomes a question of, well, how do I compare proposal 3B and 3A to each other? And you can see the formula down there on the bottom left, that the incremental performance cost ratio is going to be the score of proposal 3B, the highest performing in that 1.3, minus the score of 3A, the highest performing of the 3 courses of action in the $1 million proposal, divided by the cost of 3B minus the cost of 3A. Kind of makes sense. And so as you look at that, 3B is going to give more bang for the buck than 3A. Why? Because the number is greater than 1. You're getting a 1.04 incremental performance cost ratio, which you can see the calculation over there. And when you're looking at the performance component of it, you've got a 0.589 compared to a 0.693. And you can make that argument that that's going to be the best alternative. All right, well, very good. That brings us to the end of this particular video. We started by talking about cultural bias. Hopefully you remember that. And this comparison to implementing risk controls. And then we finished by switching to a different article that said, the people stuff isn't important. It's about numbers. and how to compare two different courses of action using an analytical hierarchical process to do so. And again, there's benefit in each of these different views into it. You have to look at your boss, you have to look at the proposal, and you're probably going to use both as you're actually trying to convince the audience of which approach is going to be the best. Are you really getting a bang for buck for doing this? Now, I will tell you, as robust as both of these approaches are, in the real world, you don't see it as much. You'd like to see it more, but lots of times folks don't go through this analysis. They actually use a different approach, which we're going to talk about in upcoming videos. So thanks for joining me for this particular video. This is the fifth of 7 videos looking at business-driven risk management. And next video, we'll pick up looking at fear, uncertainty, and doubt, a very common approach to making decisions about security or risk management, and looking at application security and what the role of the Chief Information Security Officer. So keep on studying. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.